The light was a weapon. It glittered off the diamond riviere, circling a society doyenne's throat. Sharp and cold. It caught the crystal flutes of champagne, turning the bubbles into 1,000 tiny, ephemeral stars. It gleamed from the polished marble floors of the grand ballroom at the Astor, reflecting a world of suffocating opulence. This was the annual Vanguard Foundation Gala, the apex of New York's philanthropic season, a place where generosity was a competitive sport, played in couture gowns and bespoke tuxedos. The air was thick with the scent of hothouse lilies and expensive perfume, a cloying sweetness that mingled with the metallic tang of ambition. On stage, standing at a sleek, minimalist lectern, was Elena Vance. To the assembled guests, she was the city's newest enigma. In less than 2 years, her tech firm, Ethel, had risen from obscurity to become a dominant force in sustainable energy solutions. And tonight, she was receiving the Vanguard Award for Innovation in Philanthropy. She was a ghost who had returned to haunt the very society that had cast her family out. In a sea of vibrant silks and jewel tones, Elena wore a gown of severe, unadorned black silk. It was a statement of elegant austerity, a deliberate contrast to the room's excess. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, revealing the clean, sharp lines of her jaw and the quiet intensity in her dark eyes. She held herself with an unnerving stillness, a composed statue in the heart of a swirling vortex of wealth and power. She finished her brief, gracious acceptance speech, the applause washing over her like a warm but distant tide, as the Foundation's chairman stepped forward to shake her hand. A single voice cut through the polite clapping, clear and resonant with practiced authority. A truly touching story of resilience. Every head turned. Standing near the front of the ballroom, a champagne flute held loosely in his hand, was Alistair Finch. He was everything Elena was not. Where she was reserved, he was expansive. Where she was understated, he was a spectacle of calculated charm. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his tuxedo tailored to within a millimeter of its life, his smile a dazzling display of predatory perfection. He was the CEO of Finch Global Consolidated, a titan of industry, a man whose name was synonymous with ruthless success. And he was the architect of her family's ruin. He took a deliberate step forward, the crowd parting for him as if by instinct. "Elena Vance," he said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr that carried across the hushed room. "We are all so terribly impressed to see you here, accepting this award. It's a testament to your, shall we say, remarkable ability to overcome adversity." The room held its breath. Everyone there, every single person who mattered in this rarefied world, knew the story of the Vance family's fall. They remembered the headlines, the whispers, the spectacular implosion of a financial empire that had once been a cornerstone of their society. They remembered the shame, the scandal, the patriarch's tragic end. Alistair's words were not a compliment. They were a stiletto, slid expertly between the ribs. Elena's expression did not change. Her gaze remained fixed on him, her posture unbroken. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you, Alistair. It's kind of you to say so." Alistair's smile widened, but it never reached his cold, gray eyes. Kindness has nothing to do with it. It's admiration, pure and simple, to rebuild from, well, from the ashes of such a spectacular misfortune. It's so admirable to see you've recovered after your family's misfortune. Some families, you see, are not so lucky. They don't get a second act. The subtext was a bludgeon. He was reminding her, and everyone else, of her place. He was branding her with her family's past, trying to reduce her triumph to a footnote in a story of failure. He was asserting his dominance, reminding the room that he was the one who had survived that long-ago financial war. While the Vances had been obliterated, the silence in the ballroom was now absolute, a thick, heavy blanket of tension. The chairman of the foundation looked flustered, unsure how to reclaim control of his own event. Photographers, sensing a story far more compelling than a simple award presentation, began to raise their cameras, lenses focusing on the silent duel taking place center stage. Elena's calm was no longer just composure. It was a presence, a force field. It was the deep, placid surface of an ocean that concealed unimaginable depths and power. She let his words hang in the air for a long, weighted moment, forcing the audience to absorb the full measure of his cruelty. Then, she leaned into the microphone, her voice as clear and cool as the diamonds on the women in the front row. "You're right, Alistair," she said, her tone even and measured. "Not everyone is so lucky. That's why the work we do at Ethel, and the philanthropic efforts of my family's new foundation, are so important. We believe in creating opportunities for those who have been left behind by a system that rewards aggression over integrity." It was a perfect parry. She had taken his veiled insult and repurposed it into a mission statement, subtly recasting him as the very embodiment of the aggressive, predatory system she was fighting against. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few people exchanged impressed, cautious glances. They were witnessing something more than a social spat. They were watching a declaration of war, delivered with surgical precision. Alistair's smile tightened at the edges. He had expected her to flinch, to show a flicker of the old pain. He had intended to publicly reopen a wound and watch her bleed. Instead, she had used his own knife to sharpen her image. He gave a slight, almost mocking bow. A noble sentiment. "We shall all be watching your progress with great interest." He turned and melted back into the crowd, the master of ceremonies once again, leaving a wake of whispers behind him. Elena watched him go, her expression unreadable. To the world, she was a woman who had gracefully weathered a public attack, but in the quiet, fiercely guarded fortress of her mind, a single thought echoed with the finality of a closing door. The wait is over. It begins now. Her composure was not a sign of forgiveness or fortitude. It was the profound, chilling calm of a strategist whose opponent had just walked, with perfect, arrogant predictability, into a trap that had been years in the setting. The suffocating opulence of the gala was a world Elena understood intimately, for it was the world that had both created and destroyed her. In the years following her family's collapse, she had learned to see it not as a home, but as a battlefield. The scent of lilies was the smell of decay masked by perfume. The clinking of crystal was the sound of alliances being forged and broken. The sharp smiles were the bared teeth of predators. Her own apartment, a stark, minimalist penthouse overlooking the dark expanse of the Hudson River, was an antidote to that world. It was a space of clean lines, muted colors, and functional beauty. There were no gilded frames, no plush velvets, no ostentatious displays of wealth. The only art on the walls were complex algorithmic visualizations generated by her company's data servers, patterns of pure information, beautiful in their logic and honesty. This was her sanctuary, her war room. Here, the power was not in what was displayed, but in what was concealed. Behind a seamless wall of Japanese ashwood was a server room that hummed with more processing power than a small nation's intelligence agency. The books on her shelves were not leather-bound classics, but worn volumes on game theory, corporate law, and forensic accounting. This was where the real Elena Vance lived, a woman forged in the fires of public humiliation and private grief. A woman who had spent 15 years meticulously planning her return. Across from her, sitting in a simple Eames chair, was Arthur Penhaligon. He was a relic of a bygone era, a man of quiet dignity, with kind, weary eyes and hands that were permanently stained with the ink of old books from his antiquarian shop. He had been her father's closest friend, the only one who hadn't abandoned them when the vultures began to circle. He was her last link to the life she had lost, her conscience, and her most trusted confidant. He couldn't resist. Could he? Arthur said, his voice a soft, gentle rumble. He swirled the amber liquid in his brandy snifter, a gift from Elena's father decades ago. The arrogance of that man is a law of nature, like gravity. It's what I counted on, Elena replied, her voice losing the formal, public cadence she'd used at the gala. Here, it was quieter, tinged with a fatigue that she allowed no one else to see. Alistair Finch believes he is untouchable. He thinks the past is a story he alone gets to write. Tonight, he tried to remind me of my chapter in his story. He doesn't know I'm writing my own book. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The glittering lights of the city spread out beneath her like a carpet of scattered jewels. For a moment, she saw not New York, but a ghost image of the past, the sprawling lawns of her family's estate, the lights blazing from every window during one of her mother's famous summer parties. A time when the name Vance meant legacy, not scandal. What Finch did to my father, she began, her voice tightening. It wasn't just a hostile takeover. It was a systematic annihilation. He used the media, regulatory loopholes, and fear. He turned our friends against us, our partners into enemies. He didn't just want the company. He wanted to erase us. Arthur nodded slowly. Your father, Edward. He was a good man. Elena, a brilliant man. But he was a builder, not a fighter. He believed in handshakes and gentlemen's agreements. Alistair Finch belongs to a different species. I learned from my father's mistakes, Elena said, turning from the window. Her face was set, her gaze hard. I learned that in this world. A gentleman's agreement is only as good as the honor of the men signing it. And Alistair Finch has no honor. Her strategy had been one of patient, relentless discipline. After her father's death and the liquidation of their assets, she had disappeared, armed with a small trust fund her mother had shielded from the creditors. She had finished her education not in finance, but in computer science and data analytics. She had worked in obscurity, building her skills, making connections not in the glittering ballrooms of New York, but in the meritocratic, data-driven world of Silicon Valley. She built Ethel from the ground up, its success based on an unimpeachable patent for energy storage that was years ahead of its time. She had made herself powerful, not with inherited wealth, but with undeniable innovation. She had made herself a fortress. Now, it was time to lay siege. Her phone vibrated on the polished concrete coffee table. A single, encrypted message appeared on the screen. It was from her other key ally, a woman who operated in a world far from Arthur's quiet bookshop. Maya. He took the bait. The whispers have started. Ready for Phase 2. Maya Singh was an investigative journalist of the old school, cynical, relentless, and allergic to authority. She had a network of sources that burrowed deep into the cracks of Wall Street, and a reputation for breaking stories that toppled giants. Elena had hired her a year ago, not with a check, but with a promise, the exclusive, career-defining story of the fall of Alistair Finch. Maya was the tactical arm of her operation, the one who could navigate the shadows while Elena operated in the light. It's time. Arthur, Elena said, her voice devoid of triumph, filled only with a solemn sense of purpose. Finch thinks he fired a warning shot tonight. He has no idea he just signaled the start of his own execution. Arthur looked at her, his expression a mixture of pride and profound sadness. He saw the brilliant, determined woman she had become, but he also mourned the carefree girl she had been forced to leave behind. "Be careful, my dear," he cautioned. "When you hunt a monster, you risk becoming one yourself." "I'm not hunting a monster, Arthur," Elena replied, her eyes as cold and clear as the winter sky. "I'm balancing a ledger, and the debt is long overdue." The gala was the public declaration. The conversation that followed, held in the sterile, soundproofed conference room of Ethel's corporate headquarters, was the true inciting incident. The room was a reflection of Elena's philosophy. A single slab of reclaimed oak served as the table, surrounded by chairs of brushed steel and black leather. One wall was a smart glass window that could, with a tap, display global market data or turn opaque for privacy. Power here was not whispered in hushed tones. It was analyzed, quantified, and deployed with surgical precision. Elena sat at the head of the table. To her left was Arthur Penhaligon, his quiet presence a grounding force. To her right was Maya Singh, who looked as out of place in the corporate setting as a wolf in a petting zoo. She was dressed in practical black jeans and a worn leather jacket, her sharp, intelligent eyes missing nothing. Her energy was a coil of restless impatience. "So, the peacock spread his feathers," Maya said, skipping the pleasantries. She tossed a tablet onto the table. On the screen was a collage of social media posts and gossip column mentions from the gala. "He made sure everyone saw him put you in your place. The narrative is already forming. Alistair Finch, the benevolent king, graciously acknowledges the return of the fallen princess. They're painting you as a charity case he's indulging." "Which is exactly what we wanted," Elena said calmly. "His arrogance is his greatest vulnerability. He believes he's in control of the story." "And now," Maya leaned forward, a glint in her eye, "we introduce a new plot point." This was the moment that set the plan into its final, irrevocable motion. Alistair's public attack was not just an insult. It was the key that unlocked the last door of Elena's strategy. For her revenge to be complete, it couldn't be a simple corporate takedown. It had to be public. It had to be a dismantling of the very myth of Alistair Finch. And for that to happen, he had to believe he was the one on the offensive. "What do you have?" Maya Elena asked. Maya tapped the screen, bringing up a complex flowchart of shell corporations and offshore accounts. Finch Global is about to announce a massive merger with a German tech conglomerate, a deal that will make him one of the 5 most powerful CEOs on the planet. The deal is clean on the surface, but the financing, that's where he's hiding his sins. She pointed to a small, obscure investment firm based in the Cayman Islands. This is the linchpin. It's a ghost entity. It exists only to launder money, to inflate asset values, and to pay off inconvenient people. Arthur squinted at the screen, his brow furrowed. "But how do we prove it? Accusations without irrefutable proof are just noise. He'll dismiss them, sue for libel, and use it to paint you as a bitter woman seeking revenge." "That's where Phase 2 comes in," Maya said, her cynical smile returning. "We don't accuse. We ask questions. I have a source, a junior accountant at his firm who's terrified but has a conscience. He can't get me the hard evidence. It's locked down on a server that's practically an NSA black site. But he can give me enough to light a fire." Elena listened, her mind processing every variable. This was the point of no return. Once Maya published her first piece, Alistair would know he was under attack, and he would bring the full weight of his immense power to bear against them. His response will be predictable, Elena analyzed, thinking aloud. He won't address the substance of the questions. He'll attack the source. He'll attack you, Maya, and he will attack me. He will try to frame this as a personal vendetta, using the very history he brought up last night as his proof. Let him, Maya said with a shrug. My reputation can handle it. The question is, can yours, Ethel, is your fortress? But it's a new one. Can it withstand a siege from a man like Finch? This was the heart of the matter. Elena had built her company on a foundation of transparency and ethical conduct. An attack from Finch would be a test of that foundation. It was a risk, but a calculated one. He will attack Ethel's legitimacy, Elena said, her voice steady. He will plant stories questioning our rapid growth, hinting at impropriety. He wants to drag me down into the mud with him, to make it seem like we are two sides of the same corrupt coin. So what's the play? Maya asked, her gaze fixed on Elena. Elena looked from Maya's sharp, questioning face to Arthur's worried one. She felt the weight of her father's legacy, the years of silent planning, the lives that could be affected by what she was about to do. But there was no hesitation. We let him, she said, her decision crystallizing into a clear, hard diamond of intent. We let him attack. We let him overplay his hand. He will think he is fighting a public relations battle, but he will actually be fighting a war of data. And he doesn't know that I control the terrain. She stood up and walked to the smart glass wall, tapping the surface. A satellite image of a massive, isolated data center in Iceland appeared. This is where Ethel's core servers are housed. It's geothermal powered, secure, and completely off the conventional grid. While Finch is busy fighting with press releases, we will be conducting a deep-level data assault. Maya, you will provide the distraction. Arthur, I need you to use your connections to track the financial tremors. And I will breach his server. The air in the room crackled with the energy of her declaration. This was no longer a theoretical plan. The inciting incident at the gala had triggered the final phase. The pieces were in motion. He wanted to remind the world of my family's misfortune, Elena said, her reflection a faint ghost on the image of the server farm. He's about to find out that I remember it far better than he does. Alistair Finch did not wait. 2 days after the gala, the first shot was fired. It came not as a cannon blast, but as a quiet, poisonous dart. A column appeared on a widely read, notoriously venomous financial blog, penned by a journalist known for his willingness to trade integrity for access. The headline was subtle, but effective. Ethel's meteoric rise, too good to be true. The article was a masterclass in insinuation. It never made a direct accusation, but it dripped with suggestive language. It marveled at Ethel's improbable growth, questioned the opaque nature of its initial funding, and raised concerns from unnamed industry insiders about the long-term viability of Elena's patented technology. The final paragraph was the kill shot, a piece of character assassination disguised as context. It mentioned Elena's return to the public eye, referencing the unfortunate circumstances of her family's past, and posing a seemingly innocent question: was she a brilliant innovator, or simply another Vance, adept at building houses of cards? The attack was precisely what Elena had predicted, but knowing it was coming didn't blunt its impact. The story was picked up by mainstream outlets, and the carefully crafted narrative around Ethel, one of innovation, ethics, and clean energy, was suddenly tainted. Her phone began to buzz with calls from concerned board members and nervous investors. The market, ever skittish, reacted. Ethel's stock, which had been on a steady upward trajectory for 18 months, dipped for the first time. This was Elena's first real test. It was one thing to plan a war in a sterile boardroom. It was another to stand on the battlefield while arrows rained down. She convened an emergency PR meeting. Her team, a group of sharp, young professionals who believed deeply in Ethel's mission, was in a state of controlled panic. "We need to issue a strong denial," said her head of communications, a woman named Chloe. "We need to hit back, hard, threaten a lawsuit. This is character assassination." Elena listened patiently, letting them all voice their concerns. She saw the fear in their eyes, the fear that the company they had worked so hard to build was fragile, that it could be torn down by whispers and lies. When they finished, she spoke, her voice a pool of calm in the turbulent room. "We will do none of those things," she said. A stunned silence fell. "A strong denial gives the story oxygen," she explained, her gaze moving from face to face. "A lawsuit makes us look defensive and litigious. Alistair Finch wants us to panic. He wants us to get into a public brawl. We will not give him the fight he wants." Instead, she laid out a different strategy. "We are going to respond with overwhelming transparency. Chloe, I want you to prepare a full, voluntary financial disclosure. We will release our audited financials for the last 3 years to the public. Everything, our funding sources, our revenue streams, our R&D expenditures. We will show them that we have nothing to hide." She turned to her Chief Technology Officer. "Ben, I want you to arrange a live-streamed technical demonstration of our battery technology. Not for investors, but for the public. Let them see it work. Let them ask questions. We will combat his insinuation with irrefutable fact." Finally, she addressed the entire room. "And I will do an interview. Not with a friendly outlet, but with the most skeptical, toughest financial journalist we can find. I will answer every question about Ethel, and I will answer every question about my family's past. We will not run from this story. We will own it." Her team was speechless. It was a terrifyingly bold strategy. To respond to an attack by voluntarily submitting to even greater scrutiny was unheard of. But as they looked at Elena, at the unshakable confidence in her eyes, their fear began to transform into something else: resolve. Navigating this crisis was like walking a tightrope. She had to manage the public fallout and reassure her company, while simultaneously advancing her secret war against Finch. Her days were a blur of board calls and strategy sessions, but her nights were spent in her apartment's hidden server room, a dimly lit space filled with the quiet hum of cooling fans. With her tech team patched in through a secure channel, she began the painstaking work of probing the defenses of Finch Global's central server. It was a digital fortress, layered with firewalls and intrusion detection systems that were state-of-the-art. Any brute force attack would be instantly detected and traced. "This isn't a door you can kick in," her lead cybersecurity expert, a young genius named Kale, told her, his voice a disembodied presence in her earpiece. "You have to find a crack, a key left under the mat." While Maya's articles, a slow, steady drip of well-sourced questions about Finch's finances, created the public diversion, Elena hunted for that key. She spent hours poring over lines of code, studying network architecture diagrams, and analyzing the digital habits of Finch's top executives. It was meticulous, exhausting work, a high-stakes chess game played in a world of pure data. The PR crisis raged for a week. Ethel's stock continued to slide. The media narrative was skeptical, but Elena held her nerve. The financial disclosures were released. The live tech demo was a stunning success, baffling experts with its efficiency. And Elena's interview, with a famously pitiless Bloomberg journalist, was a masterstroke. She was calm, direct, and unflinchingly honest. She acknowledged the pain of her past without dwelling on it. And she spoke about Ethel's technology with a passion and authority that was impossible to fake. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Tech journals praised Ethel's transparency. Respected financial analysts began to push back against the initial, scurrilous report, labeling it A baseless smear. The stock stabilized, then began to creep back up. Elena had survived the first obstacle. She had not only weathered Alistair's attack, but she had used it to strengthen her company's reputation for integrity. She had proven that her fortress was strong. But she knew this was just the opening salvo. Alistair was not a man who gave up easily. He would be enraged by her success, and his next attack would be far more direct and far more dangerous. And she still hadn't found the key to his fortress. The rising action was a quiet, tense crescendo played out in the shadows. While Elena managed the public face of Ethel, her two allies moved through the city's undercurrents, hunting for the proof she needed. Maya Singh met her whistleblower, the junior accountant, in places that didn't seem to exist on a map. One night, it was under the rumbling ironwork of the Manhattan Bridge, the air thick with the smell of river water and exhaust fumes. The accountant, a young man named Leo with terrified eyes and a tremor in his hands, passed her a thumb drive wrapped in a napkin. "This is all I could get," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of a passing subway train. "It's not the raw data. It's a log file. It tracks access to a partition server they call Erebus. No one is supposed to know it exists. The CFO accesses it once a month, always from a remote, encrypted IP address. It's where they keep the real books." Leo looked around nervously, his shoulders hunched against the cold. "He's getting paranoid. Finch, they're sweeping for bugs, monitoring emails. I can't get you anything else." "I'm sorry." "You've done more than enough," Maya assured him, her voice unusually gentle. She slipped a prepaid burner phone into his hand. "This has one number in it. If you need to disappear, you call it, understand?" Leo nodded, then scurried away into the darkness. A small ghost swallowed by the city. The log file was not the smoking gun, but it was a map to where the gun was hidden. Meanwhile, Arthur Penhaligon embarked on a different kind of investigation. His world was not one of burner phones and clandestine meetings, but of dusty archives, private clubs, and conversations held over glasses of sherry. He was searching for the past, sifting through the wreckage of the Vance family's collapse, looking for whispers and rumors that might have been missed in the original chaos. He spent weeks in the New York Public Library's business archives, his gnarled fingers carefully turning the brittle pages of old financial reports and shareholder minutes from 2 decades ago. He used his membership at the Union Club, a place where secrets were currency, to engage old acquaintances, men who had been on the periphery of the battle between Finch and his father. "Everyone remembers the outcome," he told Elena during one of their nightly calls. "But the details, they've become fuzzy. Like an old photograph. People remember Finch as a brilliant strategist, and your father as a tragic figure who couldn't adapt." "The victor writes the history," Elena replied, her voice tired. She was deep into the digital siege, spending 16 hours a day searching for a way into the Erebus server. Then, one rainy Tuesday, Arthur found something. It wasn't in a library or a private club. It was in a box of his own old records, stored in the basement of his bookshop. It was a preliminary prospectus for a small, family-owned manufacturing business in upstate New York that had been seeking investment from Vance Enterprises. Just before the collapse, the business was called Finch & Son Metalworks. He called Elena immediately. "I think I found something," he said, his voice trembling with a strange excitement. "A piece of the puzzle that doesn't fit the story we've always been told." He described the document, the names, the timeline. A small company, heavily in debt, that had invested its entire pension fund into a high-risk Vance Enterprises subsidiary at the recommendation of a broker. A subsidiary that had been the first to go bankrupt when Finch Global began its hostile takeover. On the other end of the line, Elena went still. The Erebus access log Maya had given her was displayed on one of her monitors. The encrypted IP address used by Finch's CFO was a complex string of numbers. But, through painstaking work, her team had traced its general origin. It wasn't a corporate IP address. It was routed through a series of proxies. But its original source was a small, residential internet provider servicing a low-income suburb in upstate New York. A suburb not 10 miles from the defunct location of Finch & Son Metalworks. The two disparate pieces of information, a dusty, forgotten prospectus, and a string of digital code slammed together in her mind with the force of a physical impact. The patterns began to form, faint at first, then sharp and undeniable. The whispers Arthur had heard about Finch's obsessive, almost personal vendetta against her father, the way he had not just acquired Vance Enterprises, but systematically dismantled every project her father had loved, sold off every asset that held personal meaning. It hadn't been business. It had been a desecration. "Cale," she said into her headset, her voice tight. "Forget the CFO. Start running a deep background analysis on Alistair Finch himself. I don't want his corporate history. I want his life. Where he was born, where he went to school, his family, everything." As her team began the new search, Elena pulled up the old news articles about her family's fall. She read them with new eyes, looking past the financial jargon and the public statements. She was looking for a ghost, a name she had never thought to search for before. And then she found it, in a minor article from a local upstate paper, detailing the wave of personal bankruptcies that had followed the Vance collapse. There was a list of families who had lost everything. Near the bottom was a single, tragic line: the family of Albert Finch, owner of the recently shuttered Finch & Son Metalworks, who lost their home and life savings. The puzzle was complete, the pieces locked into place, forming a picture that was darker and more terrible than she could have ever imagined. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding in her chest. The cold, calculated revenge she had been planning for 15 years suddenly felt small, almost naive. She had been playing a game of chess, while Alistair Finch had been fighting a holy war, and she finally understood why. The revelation was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of profound, chilling horror. It reframed everything, twisting the narrative of her life into a shape she no longer recognized. She had always seen herself as the righteous victim, the wronged daughter seeking justice for her father's legacy. Now, staring at the grainy news clipping on her screen, she saw a second victim, a mirror image of herself, forged in the same fire of loss and humiliation. Alistair Finch was not a simple corporate predator driven by greed. He was a son, just as she was a daughter. The financial collapse orchestrated by her father, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to save his company that had gone catastrophically wrong, had not just destroyed the Vances. It had been the first domino. The failure of that high-risk subsidiary had wiped out the life savings of hundreds of smaller investors, blue-collar families, people like the Finches who had trusted Edward Vance with their futures. Her father hadn't been malicious. He had been reckless, blinded by a pride that made him believe he could salvage a sinking ship. But the outcome was the same: ruin. For her family, it meant the loss of a fortune and a name. For Alistair's family, it meant the loss of everything. Elena felt a wave of vertigo, as if the floor of her perfectly ordered world had just dropped away. Alistair's entire life, his relentless climb to the top, his obsessive need to acquire and dominate, his cruel, personal destruction of her father. It was all a long, meticulously planned act of revenge. He hadn't just wanted to become powerful. He wanted to become powerful enough to do to her family what her father had done to his. She stumbled out of her server room and into the dark, silent living space of her apartment. The city lights, once a symbol of her ambition, now seemed to mock her. She sank onto the sofa, wrapping her arms around herself, a sudden, unfamiliar cold seeping into her bones. She called Arthur. When he answered, his voice thick with sleep, she didn't waste time with greetings. "It was personal," she said, her own voice sounding hollow and distant. "All of it. It was always personal." She explained what she had found: the metalworks, the lost pension, the name in the old newspaper. Arthur was silent for a long time on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding. "My God," he whispered. "Edward never knew. He was so consumed by his own failure, by Finch's attacks. I don't think he ever truly understood the full scope of the damage. He saw the numbers on a balance sheet, not the faces of the families." Alistair made sure he saw his face. Elena said bitterly, "He made himself the face of all of them. He's a dark mirror. Arthur, everything I am driven, focused, determined to reclaim a legacy he is too. We were both shaped on the same anvil of tragedy." This knowledge was a heavier burden than any corporate sabotage. How could she seek justice when the man she sought it from was himself a product of an injustice caused by her own family? Her clear, righteous path had dissolved into a moral quagmire. "What does this change?" Elena Arthur asked gently. "I don't know," she confessed, and the admission felt like a crack in her armor. For the first time in 15 years, she was uncertain. Her plan had been built on a foundation of absolute moral clarity. She was right. He was wrong. Now, the foundation was fractured. She spent the rest of the night staring out at the city, wrestling with the ghost of her father. She had always worshipped his memory, polishing it until it shone with the light of martyrdom. Now she had to confront a more complicated truth. He was a good man who had made a terrible mistake, a mistake that had created a monster. And that monster was now her nemesis. By dawn, as the first pale light began to creep over the horizon, a new resolve began to form within her. It was harder, colder, and more complex than the simple thirst for revenge it replaced. Her mission had not changed, but its purpose had deepened. This was no longer just about restoring the Vance name or punishing a villain. It was about exposing the whole, ugly, painful truth, not just Alistair's crimes, but her father's mistakes as well. Justice, she now understood, was not about victory. It was about revelation. She had to expose Alistair's widespread corporate fraud, not just as an act of greed, but as the final, corrupt chapter in a generational tragedy. He had used a legitimate grievance as fuel to build an empire on a foundation of lies. He had become the very thing he claimed to despise. Her path was clear again, but it was no longer a triumphant march. It was a somber pilgrimage. She had to finish this, not just for her father, but for the memory of Alistair's father, and for all the other families who had been caught in the crossfire. She had to destroy Alistair Finch, not as an act of vengeance, but as an act of tragic, necessary closure. Armed with this devastating new understanding, Elena faced her own moral Rubicon. The knowledge of Alistair's motivation did not soften her resolve. It sharpened it into a finer, more dangerous point. But just as she recalibrated her strategy, Alistair, sensing the net tightening around him, made his most ruthless move yet. He didn't come at her through the press or the market. He came for her directly, through the one person she couldn't defend: her father. The message arrived via a discreet, white-gloved courier. It was a single, heavy vellum envelope with her name on it, written in elegant, Old-world calligraphy. There was no return address, but she knew who it was from. Inside was not a letter, but a single, folded sheet of paper. It was a photocopy of a page from a diary. The handwriting was her father's. The entry was dated from the final week before the collapse of Vance Enterprises. It was a frantic, desperate scrawl, the words of a man at the end of his rope, and it detailed a secret he had taken to his grave, in his final, desperate bid to secure a bailout loan. He had been forced to compromise. He had provided a competitor with proprietary research data, the result of years of work by his most loyal employees, in exchange for a promise of temporary financial relief. It was a profound betrayal of his own principles and his own people. The loan, of course, never materialized. The competitor used the data, and her father was left with nothing but his shame. At the bottom of the photocopy, a single sentence was typed in stark, modern font. The past is never truly dead. Is it? It's not even past. Alistair had found it. He had dug into the wreckage of her father's life and unearthed his deepest shame. The threat was unspoken, but terrifyingly clear if she continued her investigation. If she exposed his financial crimes, he would release this diary entry. He would destroy what little was left of her father's honorable reputation. He would prove to the world that Edward Vance was not a tragic victim, but a weak and dishonorable man who had betrayed his own company. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. This was a masterstroke of cruelty. Alistair was forcing her into an impossible choice. She could pursue justice for the public. For the shareholders, Alistair was defrauding, but only at the cost of her private, personal mission to restore her father's name. Or she could protect her father's legacy, but in doing so, she would have to back down, letting Alistair win, allowing his far greater crimes to remain hidden. She sat in her silent apartment, the photocopy trembling in her hand, feeling the full weight of Alistair's twisted genius. He had found the one pressure point she had thought was safe, the one vulnerability she had never anticipated. He had turned her own love and loyalty for her father into a weapon against her. She went to her father's old study, a room she had painstakingly recreated in a small corner of her apartment. His mahogany desk, his worn leather chair, his collection of maritime histories. It was her private shrine. She pulled a locked box from a hidden drawer in the desk. Inside were the rest of his diaries. She had read them all countless times, but she had never seen the entry Alistair had sent. He must have torn it out, intending to destroy it. But somehow, it had survived. A ticking time bomb waiting for his greatest enemy to find it. She spent hours in that room, the scent of old paper and leather filling the air, grappling with her choice. What was justice? Was it protecting the idealized memory of a loved one, even if that memory was built on a partial truth? Or was it exposing a greater evil, even if it meant revealing the painful flaws of the person you were trying to honor? Her conversation with Arthur that night was the most difficult of her life. "He is forcing you to choose between two different kinds of truth," Arthur said, his voice heavy with empathy. "The private truth of your father's final, desperate days, and the public truth of Alistair Finch's criminality. If I release what I know about Finch, he will paint my father as a cheat and a fraud," Elena said, her voice raw. "He'll use it to invalidate everything I'm doing. He'll say it proves that the Vances have always been corrupt, that I'm no better than my father." "And what do you believe?" Elena Arthur asked softly. "Was your father a cheat and a fraud?" "No," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes for the first time in years. "He was a good man who made a terrible choice under unimaginable pressure. He was flawed. He was human." And in that moment, the answer became clear. Alistair's threat was built on the assumption that she needed a perfect, sanitized version of her father to champion. He believed her strength came from a lie, from the myth of the flawless victim. He was wrong. Her strength came from the truth, all of it. To honor her father was not to hide his flaws, but to understand them, to accept his humanity. His mistake was a part of his story, just as his brilliance and his kindness were. To win, she realized, she couldn't just tell Alistair's story. She had to tell the whole story, including the parts that were painful and complicated for her. The moral crisis had become her key to victory. Alistair thought he was giving her a choice between her father's legacy and justice. He didn't realize she was about to choose both. She would not back down. She would accelerate her plan. And when the time came, she would be the one to reveal her father's secret, not as a source of shame, but as the first tragic chapter in a story that would end with Alistair's complete and utter ruin. She would take his greatest weapon and turn it into her shield. The climax was set for the grand theater of modern capitalism, the annual shareholder meeting of Finch Global Consolidated. The venue was a cavernous hall in a downtown convention center, a space designed to inspire awe and project power. The room was filled with 1,000 people, investors in tailored suits, stoic board members, and a gallery of journalists from every major financial news outlet, their cameras poised like predators waiting for a kill. The air buzzed with anticipation. Today, Alistair Finch was expected to officially announce the monumental merger with the German tech firm, a deal that would cement his legacy and make him virtually untouchable. Alistair stood at the podium on the brightly lit stage, a colossal screen behind him displaying the soaring upward curve of the Finch Global logo. He was in his element, a king addressing his court. His voice was smooth, confident, and resonant with power as he detailed the company's record profits and outlined his vision for a future of limitless growth. This merger, he declared, his arms spread wide, is not just an acquisition. It is the dawn of a new era, an era of unparalleled synergy, innovation, and shareholder value. The room was his. He held them in the palm of his hand, their faces reflecting the glow of their projected earnings. In the third row, Elena Vance sat perfectly still, an island of calm in a sea of enthusiasm. No one paid her much mind. She was just one CEO among many. What they didn't know was that, through a series of quiet, brilliant proxy maneuvers executed over the preceding weeks, Arthur Penhaligon had secured her a block of voting shares large enough to grant her a 5-minute slot on the speaker's agenda. She was listed under the innocuous heading, E. Vance, Ethel Corp., Shareholder Concern. Alistair finished his triumphant speech to thunderous applause. He was beaming, a man at the absolute zenith of his power. The moderator stepped to the podium. We now have time for a brief shareholder comment. I call upon E. Vance of Ethel Corporation. A ripple of surprise went through the room. Heads turned. Alistair's smile faltered for a fraction of a second as he saw Elena rise from her seat and walk calmly toward the stage. He recovered instantly, his expression shifting to one of mild, paternalistic amusement. He gestured graciously to the podium, a silent invitation to the little girl to come and play with the grown-ups. He had no idea he was inviting his executioner to the gallows. Elena stepped onto the stage. She did not go to the main podium but stood slightly to the side, at a smaller lectern reserved for shareholder comments. She looked out at the sea of faces, her gaze sweeping over the investors, the board, the press, and finally landing on Alistair Finch. Good morning, she began, her voice steady and clear, amplified by the hall's perfect acoustics. My name is Elena Vance. Some of you know me as the CEO of Ethel. But today, I am here as a stakeholder in a story that began long before many of us were in this room. A confused murmur spread through the audience. This was not the expected question about quarterly earnings. Mr. Finch spoke of a new era. Elena continued, her voice gaining strength. But to understand the future, we must first be honest about the past. 20 years ago, a company called Vance Enterprises collapsed. My father, Edward Vance, was its CEO. Its collapse was a tragedy that ruined many lives, including my own. Alistair, still seated on stage, leaned back in his chair, a faint, condescending smirk on his lips. He thought he knew where this was going, a plea for sympathy, a desperate, emotional appeal. What the public history has never fully acknowledged, Elena said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing the audience in, is that my father made a terrible mistake. In the final days, under immense pressure, he betrayed his principles and compromised sensitive company data in a desperate attempt to save his firm. It was a moment of weakness, a flaw in an otherwise honorable man, a flaw I acknowledge here today, fully and without reservation. The room was stunned into absolute silence. A confession, a public admission of her own family's failing. Alistair's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. This was not part of his script. But that mistake, Elena's voice hardened, becoming steel, was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of another. It was the seed from which a different kind of corruption grew. A corruption that has been hiding in plain sight for 2 decades, right at the heart of Finch Global. She raised her hand, and, on the massive screen behind the stage, the Finch Global logo dissolved, replaced by a complex web of offshore accounts and shell corporations, the very chart Maya had shown her weeks ago. For the last year, my team and I have been conducting a forensic audit of this company's finances. What we found is a carefully constructed house of cards, a systematic, multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme designed to inflate assets, hide liabilities, and enrich a select few at the expense of every single shareholder in this room. Gasps echoed through the hall. The board members on stage stared at the screen in horror. The journalists began typing furiously, their cameras now focused entirely on Elena. The Erebus server, Elena said, and a new diagram appeared on the screen, showing the flow of illicit money through the ghost entity. This is Finch Global's secret ledger, where the real numbers are kept. And we have it all. She clicked a remote in her hand. A flood of incriminating documents, encrypted emails, and secret bank transfers filled the screen. Proof. Irrefutable. Overwhelming proof. But this was never just about money, Elena said, turning her gaze directly to Alistair, who was now ashen-faced, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning terror. This was about revenge. And then, she told the entire story. She wove together the financial crimes with the personal tragedy. She told the room about Finch & Son Metalworks, about the lost pension, about a young boy who watched his family lose everything and swore vengeance. Alistair Finch used a legitimate grievance to justify a lifetime of illegitimate acts, she declared, her voice ringing with the clarity of absolute truth. He built an empire fueled by his own pain, but he built it on a foundation of lies that victimized thousands more, just as his family was once victimized. The cycle of pain ends today. The chaos was immediate. Shouts erupted from the floor. The press gallery was a frenzy of activity. The board members were on their feet, staring at Alistair not as their leader, but as their destroyer. Alistair Finch tried to speak, to rise from his chair, but he seemed paralyzed. The architecture of his life, so carefully constructed over decades, had been demolished in 5 minutes. He was exposed, not just as a criminal, but as a tragic, broken figure. His life's purpose revealed as a hollow, self-devouring obsession. His ruin was total, absolute, and most importantly, public. He was undone not by a hidden enemy, but in the full glare of the world he had fought so desperately to conquer. Witnessed by the very people whose approval he had craved, Elena had not just defeated him, she had claimed the whole, complicated truth, and in doing so, she had set herself, and everyone else, free. In the immediate aftermath, the world convulsed. News channels broke into their regular programming with the headline, "Finch Global Implodes." The stock was halted, but it was a pointless gesture. The company was already a ghost, its value annihilated by the truth. News reports, running on a continuous loop, detailed the breathtaking scale of Alistair's fraud, accompanied by the dramatic footage of Elena's speech and Alistair's public unraveling. Federal investigators, armed with the data packet Elena's team had anonymously delivered to them moments after her speech, descended on Finch Global's headquarters, carting out boxes of evidence. The empire was being dismantled, piece by painful piece. Elena watched none of it, while the world consumed the story. She retreated to her sanctuary, her quiet penthouse apartment. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. There was no triumph, no elation, only the quiet, heavy finality of a long war finally ended. Arthur was there, waiting for her. He didn't speak when she entered, simply enveloped her in a hug that smelled of old books and unwavering loyalty. She leaned into him, the first moment of rest she had allowed herself in years. "It's done," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You did it, my dear," he said, his own voice heavy. "You told the truth. All of it." They sat by the window, watching the evening settle over the city. The lights began to twinkle on, indifferent to the corporate titan that had fallen that day. For a long time, they said nothing, simply sharing the silence. The victory was not a celebration, but a quiet, solemn acknowledgement of a painful but necessary conclusion to a generational wound. "I feel—" Elena struggled for the word. "Hollow. I spent so long focused on this one goal, this one point on the horizon. And now that I'm here—" "You're grieving," Arthur said gently. "You're grieving for your father, for the girl you used to be, perhaps even for the man Alistair Finch might have been, if his life hadn't been twisted by tragedy." She knew he was right. Her act of justice had also been an act of destruction. She had brought down a corrupt man, but she had also exposed the flaws of the father she loved and laid bare the private pain of two families for the world to see. There was no clean victory in a war like this. A few days later, a single image appeared in the news. It was a photograph of Alistair Finch being led from a federal courthouse in handcuffs. He was no longer wearing his immaculate tailored suit, but a standard-issue jumpsuit. His silver hair was disheveled, his face gaunt and empty, and the look in his eyes was not one of anger or defiance. It was the vacant, hollow look of a man whose life's purpose had been stripped away, leaving nothing behind. The fire of his decades-long vendetta had been extinguished, and all that remained were the cold, empty ashes. He was a ghost, haunted by a past he could never escape, and a future he had completely destroyed. The great Alistair Finch had not been defeated by a business rival. He had been consumed by his own story. Elena saw the photo, felt a pang of something that was not pity, but a deep, sorrowful understanding, and then closed the page. That chapter was over. Months passed. The seasons turned. The world, with its insatiable appetite for new stories, moved on. The collapse of Finch Global became a case study in business ethics courses, a cautionary tale of hubris and revenge. Alistair Finch, convicted on dozens of counts of fraud and conspiracy, began a long prison sentence, disappearing from the public consciousness into the anonymity of a federal inmate number. Elena Vance, however, did not disappear. Ethel, its reputation for integrity now unassailable, flourished, but her focus had shifted. Wealth and power, she had learned, were not the endgame. They were tools. The question was what to build with them. One crisp autumn morning, she stood on a windswept hill overlooking the Hudson River Valley. Before her lay the skeletal remains of what was once her family's grand estate. The house had been sold off and fallen into disrepair decades ago, its gardens overgrown, its stone walls crumbling. It was a place of ghosts, the epicenter of the tragedy that had shaped her life. She was not alone. With her were Arthur, Maya, and a small group of journalists and community leaders. There were no grand podiums or multimedia screens. There was only the wind, the rustling leaves, and Elena's clear, steady voice. "This place was once the symbol of my family's ambition," she began, gesturing to the ruins. "And later, it became the symbol of our failure. For years, I dreamed of rebuilding it, of restoring the Vance name to its former glory. But I've come to realize that we can't rebuild the past. We can only build a better future." She announced the formation of the Vance Foundation, but it was not a typical philanthropic entity designed for galas and high society prestige. Its mission was specific, born from the painful lessons of her own life and Alistair's. "The Vance Foundation," she declared, "will be dedicated to providing financial and legal support to families and small communities financially ruined by corporate malfeasance. It will fund whistleblower protections, support independent financial journalism, and offer grants to those who have lost everything to the kind of greed and corruption that destroyed my family, and so many others." She was using her restored power and wealth not to rebuild a monument to her own past, but to create a shield for others. She was turning her pain into a purpose that was larger than herself. It was the final, definitive answer to the question of what justice truly meant. It wasn't about revenge or restoration. It was about redemption. Later that week, back in her apartment, a simple, hand-delivered letter arrived. It was on plain, inexpensive stationery. The return address, a small town in upstate New York she now knew well. She opened it with cautious hands. The handwriting inside was neat, feminine, and unfamiliar. "Dear Miss Vance, my name is Sarah. Alistair Finch is my older brother. I have followed the news of what happened. For 20 years. I watched my brother be consumed by a hatred that poisoned him and our family. He told a story of our past that was filled with anger, a story that left no room for forgiveness or healing. It was the only story he knew how to tell. What you did, telling the whole truth, including the difficult parts about your own father, was a brave and painful thing. You gave us back the full story. You gave us back the truth that my father was a good man, and your father was a good man, and they were both caught in something bigger than themselves. My brother's actions were monstrous, and he must answer for them. But in exposing his crimes, you also exposed the wound at the heart of it all. Thank you for telling the truth. Now, we can finally heal." Elena held the letter, the paper cool against her skin. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, not a tear of sorrow, but of release. This was the final surprise, the unexpected grace note in a symphony of pain. Her long, calculated act of revenge had become. In the end, an act of liberation, not just for herself, but for them all. The ledger was balanced. The ghosts were at peace.